In the second quarter of 2026, China's National Bureau of Statistics released a number that Beijing had spent months trying to avoid. Gross domestic product grew 4.3% year-on-year, down from 5.0% in the first quarter, missing the 4.5% consensus forecast from economists surveyed by Reuters, and falling below the floor of the government's own 4.5 to 5% annual target. It was the weakest quarterly growth rate since the final months of 2022, when the country was still locked inside its zero COVID controls. This is not a one-off dip. It is the visible tip of a slowdown that has been building for years, and the numbers underneath the headline figure are what make this moment genuinely alarming. Start with exports, the one part of the economy still functioning. In the first half of 2026, Chinese exports rose 17.6% year-on-year, and in June alone, they jumped 27%, pushed by overseas demand for electric vehicles, batteries, and AI-linked hardware like semiconductors and computing equipment. In April, monthly exports hit an all-time record of $359.44 billion. On paper, that looks like strength. In practice, it is a symptom of the disease. A country cannot keep growing by selling more to the rest of the world while its own citizens stop buying from it. Retail sales in June rose just 1.0%, a rebound from a decline in May. But the details matter more than the headline. Sales of communication equipment and cosmetics rose, while purchases of cars and other big-ticket items stayed weak. Chinese households are spending on small comforts and avoiding the large financial commitments that drive real domestic demand. The reason they're avoiding those commitments is the second and larger problem, the property sector, which for 2 decades functioned as the actual engine of the Chinese economy. Between 2006 and 2020, roughly half of all new residential construction on Earth happened inside China's borders. Real estate and related industries, including steel, cement, construction, and local government finance, accounted for somewhere between 25% and a third of total economic demand at the sector's peak. That engine seized up after the 3 red lines debt restrictions were introduced, and Evergrande, once the country's largest developer by sales, defaulted. That was 2021. It is now 2026, and the crisis is in its 6th year with no resolution in sight. New home prices fell again in June 2026, part of a long consecutive stretch of year-on-year contraction across China's 70 tract cities, though the pace of decline eased slightly to 0.1%. Property investment nationally has collapsed somewhere between 50% and 80% from its peak, depending on the region measured. Developers are still sitting on unfinished apartment complexes that buyers paid for years ago and never received. That collapse feeds directly into problem 3, deflation. China has now experienced persistent deflationary pressure for roughly 10 consecutive quarters, the longest such stretch since its transition to a market economy began in the late 1970s. Consumer price growth is stuck around 1.2% against a government target of 2%. This matters because deflation is self-reinforcing in a way inflation is not. When prices are expected to fall further, households and businesses delay purchases, which reduces demand further, which pushes prices down again. Economists studying Japan's so-called lost decades recognize the pattern immediately. And several analysts, including strategists at BNP Paribas, now describe China's economy as undergoing the same kind of structural transition Japan went through in the 1990s, just compressed and arriving alongside a much larger population and a much larger debt pile. Which brings us to problem 4, debt. Chinese financial media outlet Yikai reported that the Chinese Communist Party has acknowledged local government debt has surpassed 100 trillion yuan, or roughly $14 trillion, with total government debt now approaching the size of the entire economy. In 2025, interest payments alone within China's local general public budgets grew 6.7% year-on-year, a rate that outpaced the official GDP growth figure for that year. That is the classic warning sign of a debt spiral. The cost of servicing existing obligations is growing faster than the economy meant to pay for them. And this is only the explicit officially recorded debt. Analysts widely believe the implicit or hidden debt held through local government financing vehicles used to fund the very infrastructure and property projects driving the crisis is significantly larger and mostly undisclosed. Then there is the demographic problem, which is slower moving, but arguably the least fixable of all. China recorded just 5.6 births per 1,000 people in 2025, the lowest rate ever registered in the country's history. Beijing has rolled out new policies to counter the decline, including covering childbirth-related hospital expenses in full, but similar pro-natal policies have shown limited effect in other aging economies, including Japan and South Korea. Combined with a rapidly aging population, this points toward a shrinking labor force supporting a growing number of retirees and an increasingly strained pension system down the line. The one sector expected to benefit is elder care. One industry estimate puts China's elder care market at over 20 trillion yuan by 2030. But that is a long-term structural shift in where the economy's activity happens, not a fix for the demand shortfall happening right now. And underneath all of this sits the youth unemployment numbers, which function as the clearest human signal of the strain. The urban unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds, excluding students, has been reported between 16.3% and 16.9% through 2026. This is not a new crisis. The rate briefly exceeded 21% in 2023, at which point the government simply stopped publishing the statistic for several months before resuming with a revised methodology. A generation of university graduates is now entering a labor market where three of the sectors that traditionally absorbed them, property, private education, and technology, have all contracted at the same time. Some of the resulting cultural response has been documented by Bloomberg, which reported that growing numbers of young Chinese are turning toward historical dramas, traditional Hanfu clothing, and nostalgic cultural movements as a form of psychological retreat from an economy that is not offering them stable careers. There is also an overcapacity problem sitting behind the export boom that looks, from the outside, like a success story. Chinese factories are producing more steel, more solar panels, more electric vehicles, and more batteries than either the domestic market or the current pace of global demand can absorb. That overcapacity is precisely why exports keep surging, even as the domestic economy weakens. Manufacturers are pushing surplus output onto foreign markets at aggressive prices simply to keep production lines running and workers employed. The problem is that this strategy is running into a wall of its own. Trade barriers are rising almost everywhere. The United States has layered tariffs on Chinese goods across multiple administrations. The European Union has opened its own investigations into subsidized Chinese electric vehicles. And a growing list of countries across the global south, including several in Latin America and Southeast Asia, have started imposing anti-dumping duties on Chinese steel and other industrial goods. The scope for China to keep absorbing its excess production capacity through exports is narrowing at exactly the moment its domestic market needs that capacity redirected toward its own consumers. China has largely avoided a direct shock from the Iran war that pushed global oil prices higher earlier in 2026, but higher energy costs still filter into an economy that imports the majority of its crude oil, adding another layer of cost pressure onto manufacturers who are already competing on razor-thin margins to hold on to export market share. Meanwhile, Premier Li Qiang has publicly called for stronger counter-cyclical measures, and investor attention has turned toward the Politburo's late July meeting for signs of fresh stimulus. But economists at Fitch, the World Economic Forum, and the Brookings Institution have all separately concluded that the stimulus measures rolled out so far, trade-in subsidies for appliances and electric vehicles, consumer vouchers, and modest interest rate cuts, are not enough to shift China from a savings-heavy economy to a spending-heavy one without much deeper reform to its welfare and pension systems. Most analysts expect Beijing to offer only modest additional stimulus unless the slowdown deepens sharply from here, largely because large-scale stimulus risks reinflating the same debt problem already straining local governments. None of this means China is collapsing tomorrow. The country still has a $20.8 trillion economy, still runs a record trade surplus, and still dominates global manufacturing in electric vehicles, batteries, solar equipment, and increasingly semiconductors. The International Monetary Fund actually raised its 2026 growth forecast for China slightly to 4.6%, though it expects growth to slow further to around 4.1% in 2027. What the data shows instead is a structural shift, an economy running two different speeds simultaneously, with an export and manufacturing sector still performing strongly, and a domestic consumption, property, and demographic base that is contracting or stagnant. For years, the gap between those two speeds was masked by aggressive government-set growth targets and by a global assumption that China's rise was simply a matter of time. In 2026, for the first time in decades, Beijing set its lowest official growth target since it began publishing the figure in 1991. That target itself, 4.5 to 5%, was effectively an acknowledgement from the top of the Chinese government that the old growth model has run its course, and that whatever replaces it has not yet been built.